All right, welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're going to tackle a really fundamental challenge for anyone who studies ancient history, one that forces us to ask a kind of weird question. Now, this isn't some kind of riddle. It's actually the central problem we face when we read one of our most important sources for 5th century Athens, a writer named Plutarch. He gives us some of the most vivid, detailed stories from this whole period, but as we're about to see, he was never actually trying to write history as we think of it. And there you have it, straight from the man himself. Plutarch explicitly tells us, I am writing biography, not history, to reveal the goodness or badness of the agent. So his goal wasn't to record facts, it was to explore moral character. Okay, so that's the big challenge, right? How in the world can we use a source that basically admits it's not trying to be a factual record? Well, in this explainer, that's exactly what we're going to do. We're going to build a critical framework for reading Plutarch, and we'll compare him to the great historian of the age, Thucydides, to figure out how we can pull real value from Plutarch's stories without being misled by them. So, before we can get to the good stuff, what Plutarch actually offers us, we have to be really clear about his profound limitations as a historical source. And that starts with, honestly, the biggest red flag of them all. Yeah, 550 years. That is the huge, enormous chronological gap between Plutarch and the events he's writing about. He was living in the Roman Empire, writing about classical Athens. To put that into perspective, that's like someone today trying to write a detailed biography of someone from the 1400s, but with no access to official archives. You can just imagine the problems this creates, right? Any official documents from the 5th century? Mostly gone. Oral traditions? Well, you know how stories change over time. Imagine that happening for centuries. And of course, every single eyewitness was long dead, so verification, basically impossible for him. And this all circles back to his real purpose. See, Plutarch wasn't writing history. He was writing something we might call biographical moral literature. His whole goal was to use the lives of famous men as ethical case studies, lessons in right and wrong. And you can see how this moral mission would have some pretty big consequences for a historian. He'd pick stories based on their ethical lesson, not because they were factually true. If a made-up anecdote made a good point about someone's character, he'd probably use it. And you see this a lot. Really complex political events get boiled down to just, he was a just man or he was arrogant, often pushing aside the real, messy political and economic forces at play. And this right here is a perfect example of another problem. Huge inflated numbers. In his Life of Cumon, Plutarch claims the Athenian general destroyed 200 Phoenician ships at the Battle of the Eurymedon. 200. Now, was it a big victory? Absolutely. But that number, it's almost certainly an exaggeration to make the story more dramatic. That's a classic feature of ancient storytelling, not sober history. Okay, so let's recap. We've got a 550-year time gap, a moralizing purpose, and a bunch of unverified details, which probably has you asking a pretty logical question. And you know what? The answer is a surprising no. Actually, he's incredibly valuable, but only if we use him the right way. His biggest value is in all the stuff he saves from being totally lost to time, especially when you put him side by side with our best source, Thucydides. Okay, so Thucydides, he is the gold standard for this period. He's analytical, he's critical, he was there. But, and this is a big but, he can be so frustratingly brief. Look at this. He covers 2 major military campaigns in one single dry sentence. That's it. And this is exactly where Plutarch becomes so useful. He was using sources that we don't have anymore, sources that are totally lost to us. And he uses them to fill in the gaps in Thucydides' bare-bones account. He gives us the story of the siege, this brilliant bit of propaganda about finding the bones of Athens' mythical founder Theseus. He gives us the political context. He's adding all this color and detail where Thucydides just gives us a skeleton. And even his obviously moralizing stories have historical value. Take that famous story about Aristides, the one where he supposedly writes his own name on a pottery shard for an illiterate guy who wants to vote to exile him. I mean, come on, that almost certainly never happened. But it tells us something incredibly important about what later Greeks believed. It shows us what they valued: justice, humility, their democracy. So it's not evidence of what happened, but it's great evidence for how a society remembered its heroes. Okay, let's make this even clearer with a direct comparison. We can really see how these 2 different approaches, the historian versus the storyteller, work in practice by looking at how they both treat the figure of Aristides. So, on one hand, you've got Plutarch. He paints Aristides as this moral icon, the just. He claims his tribute assessment for the new Delian League was so fair it pleased everyone. Now, over on the other side, you've got Thucydides. He confirms, yep, Aristides did the assessment. But his wider, more analytical history makes it crystal clear that the League was often a tool of force, and that Athenian power was deeply resented. So you see the difference? Plutarch gives us this romantic ideal. Thucydides gives us the messy, harsh political reality. So this is really the crucial point. We are not just comparing two writers. We're comparing two fundamentally different projects. Thucydides is trying to do scientific history. He's our essential primary source. Plutarch is writing moral biography. He's a supplementary secondary source, and he's compiling stories without that same critical filter.
All right, so this brings us to the ultimate takeaway. This is the simple, powerful rule you need to remember if you're a student of this period, a rule for how to use these two sources together to get the most complete picture possible.
I call it the historian's golden rule. Whenever you read a claim in Plutarch, you have to stop and cross-reference it with Thucydides by asking 3 simple questions. This little framework is how you sort the information critically. And the answer to each question gives you a clear path forward. So if they agree on a basic fact, like say Cimon campaigned at Skyros, great, that boosts our confidence. If Plutarch adds a detail, like the story about finding Theseus's bones, we treat it as interesting, valuable context, but we have to admit it's ultimately unverifiable. And finally, if they flat out contradict each other, you always trust Thucydides. He's the contemporary source with the critical historical method.
Ultimately, if you remember one thing, remember this. Thucydides provides the framework, the reliable historical skeleton. He gives you the who, what, where, and when. Plutarch comes along and adds the color, the personality, the muscle. He adds the stories that bring the whole thing to life. But you just have to handle that part with extreme care.
And all of this leaves us with one final, kind of provocative thought. The whole case of Plutarch really forces us to ask a much bigger question, not just about ancient Greece, but about all of history. How much of what we think we know about the past is actually shaped not by the hard, messy facts, but by the clean, compelling, moral stories we choose to tell about our heroes and our villains?